The alarms are already screaming before anyone fully understands why. Somewhere deep inside Reactor 4, men are standing frozen in a corridor lit by emergency lights, staring at black pieces of graphite scattered across the concrete floor where graphite should never be. The air smells like burning metal, wet steam, electrical fire. Someone says the reactor is intact. Someone else asks why pieces of the core are outside the building, and for a moment nobody answers him, because outside, above the power station, the night sky over Chernobyl disaster is glowing blue, not from fire, not from floodlights, but from something nobody in the room has ever seen before. Control panels are still blinking, telephones still ringing, operators still shouting reactor numbers to each other, as if the station can somehow still be controlled. But several floors above them, the roof is gone, the reactor is open, and men who do not yet understand they are already dying are walking directly toward it. A radiation meter begins crackling violently, then stops. One of the engineers shakes it in frustration. The reading is impossible. Another meter is brought in. It fails too, because the numbers climbing through the reactor building are higher than the equipment was ever designed to measure. But inside the control room, under the heat of the lights and the constant scream of alarms, senior officials are still insisting the core cannot have exploded. It is not supposed to be possible. Outside, firefighters are arriving beneath the blue glow without protective gear. Some are already climbing onto the burning roof. They still believe this is an electrical fire. They do not yet know pieces of the reactor are lying around them like burning stone. And across the sleeping city of Pripyat, apartment windows are beginning to light up one by one. People are waking, walking onto balconies, looking toward the power station, watching the strange light rising into the night sky, while inside the plant, someone finally says the words nobody wants to believe. The reactor is gone. The corridor outside the control room is filling with smoke now. Thin at first, drifting low across the floor beneath the emergency lights, carrying the smell of hot concrete and burning insulation through the reactor building, while operators move quickly between telephones and instrument panels, trying to understand what has failed badly enough to shake the entire station. Because the explosion had not felt like a single blast. It had felt wrong, layered, mechanical, followed by something deeper that several men cannot stop replaying in their heads. A second shock powerful enough to lift doors from hinges and throw dust from the ceiling several floors underground. And now every few seconds another alarm begins screaming somewhere else in the plant, another warning light, another system failing, another signal that the station is slipping beyond control while the men responsible for stabilizing it are still trying to convince themselves the reactor itself remains intact. Because if the core exploded, if Reactor 4 is truly open, then nothing inside this building is behaving according to the laws they were trained to trust. One of the younger operators wipes sweat from his face and stares down at a radiation meter trembling violently in his hand, the needle buried hard against the limit before suddenly dropping dead again, broken, useless, while another engineer argues with him that the reading cannot possibly be correct because the numbers reaching the meter would mean the reactor hall itself is flooded with lethal radiation, levels so high they do not belong inside a functioning power station, levels that belong to something impossible. But before the argument can continue, the lights flicker again overhead, and somewhere deeper inside the building, there is the sound of collapsing metal, followed by a burst of steam rolling through the ventilation system. Outside, the night air above Chernobyl is glowing brighter now. Workers crossing the yard between buildings keep slowing down to stare upward at the strange column of blue light rising from Reactor 4 into the darkness like something alive, beautiful from a distance, almost silent except for the constant hiss of burning graphite and ruptured pipes, while fragments of radioactive debris continue falling across the station grounds without anyone fully understanding what they are walking through. Black chunks scattered across the concrete, some still glowing faintly red around the edges, hot enough to burn through boots. But the firefighters arriving at the plant do not know that yet. They step from their trucks carrying ordinary equipment, ordinary helmets, ordinary gloves, believing they have been called to fight an industrial roof fire. And several of them immediately begin climbing toward the reactor building, carrying hoses over their shoulders, while smoke drifts around them into the cold night air. Inside the control room, the pressure is changing, voices louder now, shorter, less certain, because systems that should still be functioning are disappearing one by one from the panels. Coolant readings unstable, fuel channel indicators dead, communication with sections of the plant failing entirely, while supervisors demand updates that nobody can give them, and every answer arriving from the reactor building creates more confusion instead of clarity. One man insists water is flooding lower levels, another claims the upper structure has collapsed, another says he saw graphite outside the reactor hall, and the room falls silent for a second after that, because graphite outside the reactor is impossible. Graphite belongs inside the core, sealed beneath thousands of tons of steel and concrete, protected, contained, yet several men have now seen it with their own eyes, and nobody wants to say aloud what that means. A door crashes open nearby as another operator stumbles into the room, pale-faced and coughing violently, his skin already flushed red across his cheeks and forehead, though he has only been inside the damaged section briefly. He tries explaining what he saw near the circulation pumps, but struggles to form the words between breaths. Steam everywhere, darkness, water running down the walls, pieces of metal twisted apart like paper, and above it all, an opening where part of the ceiling should still exist. But one of the senior engineers interrupts him almost immediately, angry now, insisting panic is spreading faster than facts, insisting the reactor cannot have exploded, because an RBMK reactor is not designed to explode. The statement hangs in the room for several seconds, as alarms continue screaming around them. Cannot, not did not, cannot, as though repeating the rules loudly enough might force reality back into place. Outside on the reactor roof, firefighters are already dying, though none of them realize it yet. They drag hoses through scattered debris while chunks of burning graphite crackle around their boots, and radioactive dust drifts through the smoke into their lungs with every breath. One firefighter pauses beside a glowing block lying near a ventilation opening and bends toward it instinctively, confused by what he is seeing, before another shouts at him to keep moving because flames are spreading across the roof toward adjacent sections of the station, and below them, beneath twisted metal and open sky, the exposed reactor core is continuing to burn, releasing radiation directly into the atmosphere, while the city of Pripyat watches from apartment balconies only a few kilometers away. Some residents have begun gathering outside, still dressed in night clothes, pointing toward the distant glow, children standing beside parents beneath the cold, early morning air, while ash drifts invisibly across the city like fine dust. Nobody has warned them to stay indoors. Nobody has told them the smoke rising over the horizon is radioactive, because inside the power station itself, the men responsible for understanding the disaster are still arguing over whether the disaster is even real, and every minute that passes is making it worse. The men moving through Reactor 4 now are still behaving as though the disaster can be controlled. That is what makes the night so terrifying. Not panic, not chaos, but procedure continuing long after reality has already broken apart. Operators are still carrying clipboards through corridors filled with smoke, still repeating pressure readings into telephones, still waiting for instructions from supervisors who themselves are trapped between what they are seeing and what they have spent their entire careers believing could never happen. Because admitting the reactor core has exploded means admitting the station is no longer a power plant at all. It is something else now, something exposed directly to the atmosphere and burning in the middle of the Soviet Union, while thousands of people sleep nearby completely unaware. Inside the control room, exhaustion is already beginning to appear on faces, despite the hour, sweat shining beneath fluorescent lights, while alarms continue flashing across dead instrument panels that no longer correspond to reality. Several operators are demanding permission to shut systems down entirely, while senior officials refuse because they still believe water must be reaching the core somewhere beneath the damage. They continue ordering men deeper into the building to manually open valves, manually inspect pumps, manually confirm conditions in areas where radiation levels are now so extreme that workers begin feeling sick within minutes of entering. One engineer returning from the lower levels leans heavily against the wall, trying to steady himself, while another asks what happened down there. The answer comes slowly, almost confused. There is water everywhere, steam, darkness, and pieces missing from the building itself. His face is already changing color beneath the lights, flushed red around the eyes and cheeks, while nausea forces him to stop speaking for several seconds. Another worker nearby suddenly vomits into a trash bin before insisting he is fine and trying to continue working anyway, because nobody fully understands what radiation poisoning feels like yet. The symptoms still seem disconnected from the catastrophe unfolding around them. Headaches, dizziness, metallic taste, skin burning beneath clothing. None of it feels large enough to explain the destruction sitting above the reactor hull. Outside, firefighters continue climbing higher onto the damaged roof, their boots crunching across radioactive graphite, scattered like broken charcoal across the concrete. One of them kicks a glowing fragment aside instinctively, and immediately feels heat shoot through the leather into his foot. Another removes his helmet briefly to wipe sweat from his forehead, despite the cold night air, and behind them the exposed reactor burns silently beneath collapsing steel, while sparks and radioactive ash rise upward into the atmosphere, carried by wind currents drifting slowly toward the city. From apartment balconies across Pripyat, families are still watching. The glow over Chernobyl has become strangely beautiful now, blue light mixing with smoke above the reactor, while children point toward it from open windows and adults gather quietly in the streets trying to understand why the power station appears to be on fire. Some residents even walk closer for a better view, standing on bridges, parking lots, sidewalks, breathing contaminated air while radioactive particles settle invisibly across clothing, hair, skin, because nobody has ordered an evacuation, nobody has warned the city, and inside the Soviet system, information moves slowly upward through layers of denial, while the disaster itself is spreading rapidly outward into the night. Inside the reactor building, the arguments are becoming more desperate. One senior engineer is still insisting the core cannot be destroyed because the control rods were inserted before the explosion. Another operator stares back at him in disbelief, asking how graphite ended up outside if the reactor still exists. The room falls silent again after that question because everyone present already knows the answer. They simply cannot force themselves to say it aloud. Several men have now physically looked into sections of the reactor hull where the roof should still be, and what they describe makes no sense. Open air, twisted metal hanging downward, flames below, pieces of the reactor exposed directly beneath the night sky. One worker finally admits he looked down into the destroyed core itself. The statement changes the room, because now denial is colliding directly against eyewitness reality. Someone quietly asks him what he saw, and for several seconds the only sound is the alarms. Then he answers, fire, glowing debris, and an opening where the reactor should have been. The silence afterward feels heavier than the explosions themselves, because every man in the room understands what that means. If the core is exposed, then radiation is pouring upward unchecked into the atmosphere, and everyone already inside the building has received far more exposure than they can survive. Yet still the orders continue. More workers sent toward damaged sections, more attempts to pump water, more efforts to restore systems that no longer matter, because institutional momentum is now trapping people inside the catastrophe. Procedure continuing automatically even as the situation becomes hopeless. And many of the men obeying those orders are doing so, not because they are fearless, but because the alternative is psychologically impossible. Accepting that the reactor exploded means accepting that the disaster is already beyond containment. Outside near the reactor building, several firefighters begin collapsing, at first quietly, one kneeling suddenly beside a hose line, complaining of weakness in his legs, another pulling off his gloves because his hands feel like they are burning, skin reddening rapidly beneath the floodlights, while medics arriving at the station still believe they are treating smoke inhalation and exhaustion. Nobody outside the reactor camp fully understands yet that these men have absorbed lethal doses of radiation within less than an hour, and above all of it, the exposed core continues burning into the dark, open to the sky, while the Soviet Union still does not understand what has happened inside Reactor 4. Morning is beginning to arrive over Pripyat now, pale gray light slowly replacing the darkness while the reactor continues burning behind the station in a column of smoke that can already be seen from kilometers away. And what makes the disaster feel unreal is how ordinary everything beneath that smoke still appears. Buses moving through intersections, apartment lights turning on, people waiting outside bakeries, workers reporting for shifts, children looking out from school windows toward the strange haze hanging over the horizon, while radioactive ash continues drifting invisibly across the city like dust carried on the wind. Because nobody has told them the reactor core is open. Nobody has told them the air itself is contaminated. And inside the Soviet system, the instinct to maintain calm is now competing directly against the speed of the catastrophe. Inside hospitals near Chernobyl, the first firefighters and reactor workers are arriving in waves, some still walking under their own power, others vomiting uncontrollably into sinks and hallway floors, while confused nurses try to understand why healthy men are collapsing, only hours after responding to what was believed to be a normal industrial fire. Several patients complain that their skin burns as though they have been standing in direct sunlight for days. Others describe a metallic taste in their mouths that will not disappear no matter how much water they drink. One firefighter sits silently on the edge of a hospital bed, staring at his own hands as redness slowly spreads across the skin beneath the fluorescent lights. And still, nobody is fully explaining what happened, because inside government buildings and emergency response centers, officials are now trapped inside a different kind of fear. The realization that acknowledging the scale of the explosion means admitting that an entire Soviet reactor has catastrophically failed in a way the state has always insisted was impossible. Telephones ring constantly between ministries, military offices, plant administrators, radiation teams, every conversation tense, fragmented, incomplete, while contradictory reports continue flooding upward from the station. The reactor is intact, the reactor hall is destroyed, radiation levels are manageable, radiation levels are impossible, fire is contained, the core is exposed, every version of reality colliding together while men in suits attempt to hold the structure of authority together through sheer refusal to panic. But reality is beginning to escape containment, because outside the reactor building, radiation levels continue climbing across the surrounding region, while emergency crews move through contaminated areas without adequate protection. Buses arrive near the city but remain waiting for instructions that still have not come. Soldiers begin appearing at roadblocks, wearing masks and carrying equipment civilians have never seen before. And residents watching them from apartment windows start realizing something about the morning feels wrong. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just wrong in a way nobody can fully explain. The birds are quieter, the streets feel tense, people keep staring toward the plant, and rumors are spreading faster now. Some say there was an explosion in the turbine hall, some say several workers are dead, some say the reactor itself has cracked open, others dismiss everything entirely and continue their day because the alternative feels too large to accept. Children still play outside beneath drifting radioactive particles, young couples walk through parks, families stand together on balconies watching helicopters circle the reactor in the distance, while the blue glow above the station fades into a towering column of smoke under daylight. And inside Reactor 4, the exposed core continues releasing contamination directly into the atmosphere, hour after hour, unchecked. Deep inside the damaged station, several workers are still attempting to restore water flow into systems that no longer exist properly, moving through dark flooded corridors with flashlights cutting through steam, while dosimeters scream at levels many of them do not even understand. One man begins coughing violently after only minutes near the reactor section. Another suddenly loses coordination while climbing stairs and grips the railing to stop himself collapsing. But they continue moving because orders are still being given, still followed, and because somewhere above them senior officials continue insisting the situation can still be stabilized if procedures are maintained long enough. Then another report arrives. Foreign radiation alarms have activated outside Soviet territory. The statement changes everything, because now the disaster is no longer trapped inside Reactor 4. It is moving across borders, across Europe, through the atmosphere itself. And inside the rooms where officials have spent hours trying to control information, silence spreads slowly as the implication settles over everyone present. The explosion cannot be hidden anymore. The world is beginning to notice, and for the first time since the reactor exploded, some of the men responsible for managing the disaster begin understanding that the catastrophe may be far larger than the Soviet Union itself can contain. Outside in Pripyat, loudspeakers finally begin activating across the city. Residents pause in streets and apartment courtyards, listening as instructions are calmly announced through static-filled speakers mounted to buildings. Temporary evacuation, documents only, buses waiting, 3 days. People are told they will return shortly, so families leave food on tables, leave toys beside beds, leave photographs hanging on apartment walls, because nobody yet understands they are walking away from their homes forever. And as columns of buses begin pulling slowly out of the city, beneath the gray afternoon sky, the smoke from Reactor 4 continues rising behind them into the atmosphere, still burning, still open, still poisoning everything downwind. By the second night, the illusion that the disaster can still be controlled is collapsing inside everyone connected to Chernobyl disaster. The reactor is still burning, the radiation is still rising, and the men who spent the first hours insisting the core remained intact are now speaking more quietly, moving more slowly, faces gray with exhaustion, while military vehicles flood the roads around the station and helicopters circle continuously above the exposed reactor, dropping sand, lead, clay, anything that might smother what is happening below. But each pass over the core exposes pilots to radiation levels so extreme that several crews begin feeling sick before they even land again. Inside temporary command centers, maps are spread across tables beneath harsh fluorescent lights, while officers and engineers argue over contamination zones expanding farther every hour. Reports arriving from hospitals are worsening rapidly. Firefighters who walked onto the roof only the night before are now barely recognizable to some of the doctors treating them. Skin darkening, swelling, blistering, several too weak to stand. And what terrifies the medical staff most is how quickly it is happening, because radiation sickness does not behave like ordinary injury. There is no visible wound large enough to explain the collapse taking place inside these men. One young firefighter keeps asking when he can return home. Another asks repeatedly why his face feels hot. A nurse changes bandages on burned hands while trying not to look frightened herself. And in nearby corridors, families wait for information nobody knows how to give them. Outside the hospital windows, soldiers are already washing streets with chemical foam, cutting down contaminated soil, checking vehicles with instruments that crackle violently near the wheels. The disaster is no longer confined to the reactor site now. It is embedded into clothing, buildings, forests, rivers, moving invisibly through the environment while entire teams are sent into contaminated areas simply because someone still has to do the work. And everywhere, procedure continues alongside fear, men taking notes, filing reports, following chains of command, even as reality grows more catastrophic by the hour. Near Reactor 4 itself, the atmosphere feels increasingly apocalyptic now. The destroyed building, illuminated at night by floodlights, smoke, steam, and the constant movement of military crews working around the exposed core, while dosimeters scream continuously across the site. Several sections of the plant are now so radioactive that workers can only remain there for seconds at a time before being pulled back out. Yet still they keep sending people in, because cables must be connected, debris moved, fires extinguished, measurements taken, and every task carries the same understanding beneath it. Someone must go, even if they may not survive long afterward. On the roofs surrounding the reactor building, crews begin clearing radioactive graphite by hand because machines fail under the radiation, men running across the surface for only moments at a time before shoveling debris over the edge and retreating back behind shielding, while officers time them with stopwatches, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 1 minute. Then the next group runs out into the contamination again, the graphite still glowing faintly in places beneath the floodlights, like fragments of another world scattered across the concrete. Some workers stop speaking almost entirely now, the psychological realization settling in, because the disaster no longer feels temporary, it feels permanent. Inside evacuation centers, families from Pripyat sit together surrounded by suitcases and blankets, while rumors spread faster than official information. Some still believe they will return home within days. Others are beginning to understand they may never see the city again. Children ask parents why soldiers are wearing masks, why helicopters keep flying overhead, why adults whisper constantly in nearby rooms, while outside rows of buses sit coated in radioactive dust beneath cold evening rain. Far beyond the Soviet border, radiation alarms continue activating across Europe. Scientists in other countries begin tracing the contamination back toward Ukraine. Foreign governments demand explanations, and the pressure building around the Soviet leadership changes from secrecy to containment. Because now the entire world understands something catastrophic has happened inside Reactor 4, even if nobody yet fully comprehends the scale. Back at the station, one exhausted engineer stands staring toward the exposed reactor during a brief moment of silence between helicopter passes. The building no longer resembles a functioning power plant. It resembles the aftermath of war. Twisted steel hanging downward, sections collapsed inward, fires still burning beneath smoke drifting into the night sky, and at the center of it all, the destroyed core glowing deep within the ruins like an open wound. For the first time since the explosion, many of the people working around the reactor are no longer asking whether the disaster can be reversed. They are asking how much worse it can still become, because the fear spreading now is larger than the reactor itself. There are discussions of groundwater contamination, of additional explosions, of entire regions becoming uninhabitable, and every new possibility feels believable because the impossible has already happened once. The reactor was not supposed to explode, The core was not supposed to be exposed. The radiation was not supposed to spread across Europe, yet all of it is already real. Through the smoke and military floodlights and contaminated rain falling softly across the station grounds, one understanding is slowly settling over everyone involved. This disaster is going to outlive them.